excited to introduce my friend Melanie. And I have known Melanie for, like I just said, about 9 years. It's been quite a while. Melanie earned a Master of Theology degree with an emphasis in spiritual formation from the Divinity School at Duke University. And while at Duke, she worked at Duke Hospital Center on Aging, went on a pilgrimage to East Africa, created and produced a documentary film on the Christian response to genocide in Rwanda, served as chaplain at a feeding ministry in Harlem, New York, and developed curriculum for the United Methodist Home for Children in Raleigh, North Carolina. Then Melanie served for 10 years as the Director of Ministry with Children in the Leadership Ministries Division of Discipleship Ministries of the United Methodist Church. And I thought I had a long title. That's an impressively long title. And that's where I met Melanie, is when she was working for Discipleship Ministries. In February of 2018, Melanie created the consulting, coaching, and advocacy firm Do Love Walk Collective, and her website is dolovewalk.co. I've known Melanie for a long time, as I've said, and I'm really excited to have her here with us today. And with that, Melanie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kathy. I'm very happy to be here. So I live in South Carolina, so you may hear a little bit of a Southern thing going on here. And it is genuine. I try to every now and then when I'm different places to not sound quite as low country as I grew up sounding, so that you all can actually understand me. But I'm thankful to be here to talk about worship. It's one of the things that I absolutely love. A little thing I will add on to what Kathy said, I have actually taught ages 3 through adults. My oldest student was 82, I think. So I've taught every grade and have worked with brain development for all grades. And what I will say is that middle schoolers are a lot like preschoolers, except for you can't be sarcastic with preschoolers. So ninth grade is a doozy, especially for boys. 8th grade is a doozy, especially for girls. 3rd grade is one of my favorites, and 11th and 12th grade. So mostly 12th grade. So here we go. I would like for you to write in the chat before we get going. What do you dream for our children? What do you dream for our children? It can be one word or phrase. Peace and connection, love, inclusion, voice, acceptance, positive connections, feeling loved. Absolutely. These are absolutely amazing, and I want you to hold on to that as we move through this, because so much of the work that we do, we have to keep in front of us what we dream for our children, what we're working for. They are why we're doing this work in this ministry. Now I'm going to share my screen with you. Accepted, loved, welcomed, and affirmed. Intergenerational connection. They can be themselves and not pressured to be who their parents want them to be. Yeah. To equip and empower them to be Christ followers. These are awesome, y'all. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. It's always really fun when I do this because you just never know. Here we go. Okay, so let me do a couple of things on my side. Worshiping with children. So this is me here. And Do Love Walk Collective was started out as just children's ministries. Now it is something that includes what is called Ubuntu, humanity. And basically it helps people to find purpose, compassion, belonging, and to learn how to reconcile. So that's one of the things that I also do that you can see at my website. And that's the only thing I'll say about what I'm doing. Okay, here we go. So worshiping with children. What is required? We want to go back to, of course, the Bible. We know that Jesus loved and honored children, and we're not to be stumbling blocks. We're very familiar with the stumbling. If you're a stumbling block for kids, for children, it is not a good thing for people new to faith and for children. And also in our Methodist DNA, we look at John Wesley as a person who actually was very focused on children, their spiritual development, their intellectual development, and saw that they needed to be honored as children of God and he respected them for who they were. And we need to tend to them graciously, which means that we have to look at what is this paradigm shift. As Kathy was talking earlier, when we had that conversation in Wisconsin around that table, it was time for a paradigm shift. So often when I was working at discipleship ministries and would talk with pastors, and even with some children's ministers, there would be this thing of, this is the way we did it when I was young and it was good enough for me. And I turned out all right. We hear people say that about a lot of things. I turned out all right. And I'm not going to argue with people turning out all right. But is it right for this time and this space? And then I also heard a lot of things that had to do with, with kids, they just need stories and songs. They don't need anything else. And this didn't come from children's ministers. This came from a lot of pastors. So that made me think we really needed to focus on how we shift this paradigm in a world that is rapidly changing, and thinking about how rapidly we changed in just the past couple of years, and how the church is changing and our denomination is changing. So what does that mean for children's ministers? No matter what the church decides, we still have work to do with our children. And families are making different choices. Families are feeling the frustration that's happening in the church. They're feeling the frustration that's happening out in the world. And they make the choices that they feel are best for their children. So how do we offer them opportunities to more deeply engage in worship? We know that children learn from the moment they enter the world. They have an innate sense of who God is, and they are not different. Sometimes we like to say that children are different, but what is different about children today is the world that they encounter. The world is different and they have to adjust to that. But essentially, children still need the same things. And COVID-19, being on lockdown, being all the things that have happened with COVID-19, and we don't have to go into that, it's opened our eyes to the needs of children. It's made it much more visible as to what our children need. So we're going to look at theological foundations, developmental considerations, worship engagement, creating belonging, and equipping adults today. I want to point out this picture. Some of you may have been here. This is the baptismal font that John Wesley was baptized in. It's pretty cool to be able to walk in the steps of the Wesleys. So we looked at, what do you dream for our children? I want you to keep that in front of you as we move along. So what is our biblical foundation in this? If you think about loaves and fishes, where were the children when Jesus was teaching? We know that children were present. We know that from John 6, because there was a child there. Where, we didn't have any other place for kids to be in the time that Jesus was doing his ministry. So children had to be present with their families. So that tells us something about what we are called to do and who we're called to be. Other things in the Bible that will help shape us and help us to understand what is expected are from other texts in the Bible. Don't ever get between them and me. Don't forbid them. Do not stop them. So Jesus was seeing children as very important, with agency, And we as adults are not to get in the way of that. We are to help encourage that and bring them on that journey. And part of that also is equipping parents to do that too. Our baptismal covenant is another place we can look at it for our why. Will you nurture one another in the Christian faith and life and include these persons now before you in your care? Surrounding them. If you look at our baptismal covenant, it talks about surrounding them. It talks about community. It talks about true disciples. And so much of this, at least a quarter of it, needs to be in the worship setting. We can look at how do we do service? How do we do prayer and study? And also how we do worship. And with worship, what does that mean for our kids? I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I tend to do that when I present because my brain is just thinking about so many things. John Wesley and children, there is a renewed study about John Wesley and children going on in England right now that I find very intriguing. Peter Benzie is doing some of this work. And even some stories about John Wesley in the town of Bath. He would take kids on carriage rides and things like that. But he also was very clear that we needed to educate children. Now, here's the thing with Wesley. 3-year-olds learning Latin is probably not exactly what is developmentally appropriate for kids, but he saw the need to educate our children for true holiness and loving God and neighbor. And so I want you to think for a moment, what messages do you hear about children in these stories from the Bible and from Wesley and from our baptismal covenant? Think about that for a moment. We're going to move on. So, practice makes perfect. We all know this. And there are lots of ways to engage in worship that are practice as far as ritual is concerned. Do children need to be in worship to learn how to worship? So a little bit about what our kids' brains are doing. It's about relationships for our kids. Their brains are developing based on environment and on relationships. And there's something that happens when children are with adults and doing what adults do. The importance of ritual is, we all know as children's ministers that children need ritual. It's done in communities. Very, very rarely do we have rituals that are not communal in some way, meaning we all do it in our own spaces or we all do it together. And there's a sense of bonding that happens because we know we are connected through these particular rituals. Now, I'm not going to go over this whole chart with you, but if you look at the work of James Fowler and of Erickson, one of the things, if you look at where the arrow is down here, that we see about how children learn is most significant relationships. And primary caregiver, parents, family, school, and community as they age. So what does this mean as far as worship is concerned? If their primary relationship is with their parent or their family or their primary caregiver, does that mean that worship needs to happen within that relationship? The UCC did a study in 1994. I guess we would call it an old study now, but it was a 40-year study as the church was shifting. Sunday school was shifting, worship was shifting. There was a significant rise in having children worship separately from adults, and worship became adult worship. And so they did the study for 40 years. and saw that when we segregate our children and youth, there was a sense of graduating from the church. And so by the time they got into the worship space, what they were finding was that children felt like it wasn't their space, because they had not been nurtured into the space. So segregated worship, and these are their terms, segregated worship, they found fails to enculturate worship and church life as cross-generational. And we talk about intergenerational all the time, and intergenerational is more than doing things side by side. It is doing things with, engaging with one another so that things are not segregated out. So I like to go back to, I try not to do things in a vacuum, because like what Kathy was saying about how we met, there's something about having lots of voices talking about what is good, what is helpful. Delia Halverson, who you all may know, I call her the godmother of Christian education. Delia actually has a lot to do with what Christian ed looks like in its foundations for the United Methodist Church. And in several of our conversations about children, we talked a lot about this developmental piece. Children learn by doing, and what better way of learning to worship is than being part of it, being in the space, but not just as observers in the space, being actually engaged. So what she sees is that children do as adults do. And we know this. I mean, we've watched children pick up the imaginary cell phone and do all the things that their parents do and that we do. And that helps them to connect. They're trying to connect with us. They're trying to get that feeling of belonging. And I would agree with Delia about that third grade thing. I taught third grade for a long time, and by the time they leave third grade, they are very different people. It's like over the winter break, suddenly they are these thinkers that are thinking for themselves, and you don't have the same street cred as you used to when they were a little younger. So just some things in general, they need to be able to observe, so be in the space to actually see what the way we do things as Christians. And holy play, what is playful in that space? Because often one of the things that can be a stumbling block for our children with worship is worship engaging. And another issue becomes for children's ministers is how much say do you have about what happens in worship? And a lot of the times, not much. So it's about advocating and educating and helping people to understand this is how children learn, and we need to look at how they learn in worship so that they continue to desire to come back to be with the body. They learn by modeling, by us modeling for them. They concrete learners see a big Bible on the pulpit, and it's big. And a concrete learner will see the Bible as anything that's big as very important. Adults are big. There's something important about that. They want to grow into that because remember, they're concrete. So they're big and little mean power and wanting to figure out what is happening with this power up here. Repetition, as we're looking at ritual, doing it over and over again. They hear the Lord's Prayer. They hear the affirmation of faith. They're saying it as they grow. It will mean different things to them as they grow, but they know it's important because they hear it repeatedly. So what happens if our children are absent from worship? Like I said, they miss some of our traditions. And I know that you all have this on your website. This has been a picture that has gone around forever. And I don't even remember the first time I encountered this picture, but I just remember it being very powerful. And you all are probably very familiar with it because it's on Michigan's website. But I think for me, this story is saying, I want to be like the adults. I want to do what adults do. I want to be a part of this community. And so the Lord's Supper is a very important part of how we honor God, how we practice as Christians. So we have to think about what does it mean to make sure that our children are present for the Lord's Supper? The singing of the hymns. No matter what those hymns are, there's something about hearing them and the singing together, making that joyful noise together that they can miss out on if they are not in worship. Baptism. Are they present when there are baptisms? Are they around the baptismal font, in the chancel, watching and observing and it being explained to them of what baptism is? The prayers of the church, like the Lord's Prayer, of course, and other prayers of the church, how are they being taught these prayers, and how are they seeing that it's something they grow into? And everyone's favorite, the passing of the peace, that we're finally able to do again safely most of the time. And what happens in that passing of the peace, offering each other the love of Christ in that time. So I want you to think for a moment, how do you make the traditions of the church accessible for young children in your congregations? Because you may not have a choice as to whether or not children are in worship. That may not be your choice. So that means that how you are even more responsible for making sure that they understand the traditions of the church. So that when they go into what a lot of churches call big church, there's a seamless transition into that space. In 2014, if you look on the right of the screen, in 2014, there was an article in a paper in the Tennessean. I was living in Tennessee at that point in time, about a church that had this sign on the doors of their sanctuary: children 3 and younger not allowed in the sanctuary during worship. Now, I saw this and I immediately was looking to make sure it wasn't a United Methodist church, because I was like, this is problematic because of the language, for sure. This is another stumbling block for our kids. And what is this saying to young parents? What is this saying to children? What is it saying to those who don't have children, those whose children are grown-ups, those who have grandchildren? What is the message, and how is this aligned with the message from John? How is this aligned? But a lot of people believe that worship is for adults. And I talked earlier about how much voice do children's ministers have. Can the experiences of worship be replicated in children's church? In a lot of ways, they can, because we have things like godly play and I'm looking back at my books, and blessed to be a blessing. And so, yes, there are ways to replicate worship in children's church. Can churches who offer Sunday school during worship help children feel included in the gathered community? And that can be very difficult, especially if you are a church that offers communion every week or every month. Then how are the children engaged in that? And is there disruption when that happens? And it takes a lot of logistical planning to make sure there are opportunities for children to be engaged in worship when Sunday school happens at the same time. And again, that is a contemporary way of having Sunday school. If you look back, let's see, it's not 40 years anymore, it's like 50 years or so, that was not a thing. I mean, it just did not happen. Good or bad, it just didn't happen. What are ways that you can help children transition from children's church to worshiping with the gathered community? And I think what I find is that for the most part, children's ministers really want children involved in and included and engaged in worship, but don't have much of a say in that. And one of the things that bubbled out of a conversation just like this several years ago, there was a children's minister who said that she brought the kids in during Advent, and people love to see children during Advent and Christmas and all of that, and they just never left. Which I thought was very clever. That could work some places, because there's something about children being present during that time that reminds us of how Jesus came into this world. Jesus came into this world as a baby, and grew into a child, into an adult. And that's a time when we're focusing on this new Christ child. Again, one of the things I've worked on for many, many years is how to create a sense of belonging for people. And my work now truly, truly focuses there. How do we create a sense of belonging? There are very few places right now where adults and children are engaged together in communally. You may say sports activities, but that is not necessarily engaged with one another. You are watching someone play and maybe you're together, and that is a very social type space. And believe me, I love to go to soccer games and lacrosse and tennis matches and things like that. But am I truly engaged with the young person with me? But church worship is one of those places where there can be true engagement. And from Debbie, children need to see adults worship. That's one of the things that she really she really thought was very important. And it is, if you think about how children learn, think about them needing to see things modeled. It becomes very important if they see the adults in their lives doing it. And Jean was talking about what they do in their church, and it's about growing in a sacred space, because worship is a sacred time. It is, we welcome in the Holy Spirit. We focus in on how we praise and honor God. We look at what we have done this week and how we can do better in the next week, how we can live our Christian lives in a way that is an example for others, how we can serve others. All of this is happening within worship. So this is a very sacred space that we want our children to be a part of. And Jessica, I love what Jessica says about expecting a 10-year-old to worship and learn like our average 60-year-old. And as I'm getting closer, I'm not 60, but as I'm getting closer to 60, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a different way that we worship as we get a little older. But here's the thing, when we were talking before this, when Kathy and I were talking, and she was talking about her kids and talking about how different they are, one of the things that used to frustrate me, and I taught high school for 3 years since 2018 and stopped this past year. And also I was the DEI director at the school. So I had a chance to see children from kindergarten to 12th grade in the school on a regular basis. And one of the things that really stood out to me with some of our teachers was that they treat all the kids the same. And that is problematic because our kids are not the same. And Kathy was talking about the difference in her two kids. And as parents, does the same thing work with each child, good or bad? No, it does not. So as teachers, we always have to be creative and clever as far as understanding. If we're going to create a sense of belonging, we have to understand that child. We have to understand what that child needs. And that's what worship needs. And again, I know that so many of you don't have a voice in worship. What I would say is give yourself voice, give yourself voice and keep advocating for kids to be seen and for worship to be accessible for our children. They don't learn the way that others learn, and worship itself needs to have elements of it where everyone can engage. That's just the bottom line with worship. I won't go deeply into that. Kathy, you can have someone come and talk about worship and in particular, as far as how it's planned. So our kids are not the same, and treating worship as if everyone is the same is not helpful for anyone, especially not for our kids. And Jessica said something, are we selfish if we expect this? I don't know, are we? Or are we not seeing? Do we have blind spots as far as our children are concerned? So how do we create a deep sense of belonging? I know that many of you likely have playgrounds. I have so many pictures of playgrounds because every church I visited, if there was one, I took a snapshot of it. And I have these three up here in particular. One of them, the one in the bottom right corner, is actually a church in Sweden. So it's all over the world, y'all. And one of the things that I did notice is if we're talking about where relationships happen as children are young, what is the responsibility of engaging parents in these spaces too? We certainly want our children to be comfortable with everyone. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the days of passing the baby in worship. Like if a mom was struggling with the baby, one of the church moms just took the baby and gave mom a break. So we love the idea of having that communal aspect for our children. But in our playgrounds, how are they set up so that they are also welcoming for the primary caregiver, for the child? And what is happening there that is not just engaging the kids this way, but engaging them this way? Not just focused on what's in front of them, but helping them to also connect with what's happening in the chancel area. And that takes some negotiation with whoever is leading worship. It's not easy. I'm not saying anything is easy, for sure. So when we had to abandon our spaces, we had to rethink church. Talk about rethink church. That was rethinking church and rethinking worship. And we had a lot of empty sanctuaries in the virtual world. I spent a lot of time teaching virtually high schoolers. That was a trip. I have lots of stories. Here's the thing is that there's a, gosh, now I'm going to forget the name of the church. It's a church in Michigan, and I'll think about it in just a moment. I started engaging with them on Sundays in their worship because a friend of mine was the pastor there. And what I found with the engagement with children was so much attention given to how we're going to include children in worship. It was over the top beautiful. And a lot of it had to do with there were so many voices of children reading scripture, families reading scripture together, families leading songs and recording songs on this very interactive Zoom. There was always a time for children that didn't talk down to them, but set them up for what the pastor was going to preach. There was a time after worship just for the young people to get together on Zoom to have, and I wasn't part of those conversations, but just to connect with one another. And outside of that, they were finding ways to safely at least lay eyes on one another, to stay connected with one another. And the thing that I loved about that was the intentionality that I saw happening between the children's minister and a pastor and worship director who were open to that happening. Okay, so I'm looking at my time. I don't want to overstay my welcome. And then engagement. We want to make sure our kids are not just observing, that they are engaged. And I know this is kind of an easy one for most of us. But here's the thing. If they're going to be engaged, they need to be a part of the worshiping community. So if you're going to ask a little one to acolyte or be the cross bearer, that child needs to be a part of that community, not coming in to do it and then go away, or coming in one Sunday and you don't see them again for 4 or 5 Sundays. So we want to make sure that they are feel part of leadership within the congregation. I'm sorry, within the worship space. So how do we create this deep sense of belonging? Engage children and youth in ritually rich worship within the whole congregation. Engage them as ritual leaders. Have them present in corporate worship on a regular basis. Make sure that they are able to lead using spiritually profound symbols. Daily discipleship, make sure this is going outside, make sure whatever the worship is, that there's something that the kids can take with them, the families can take with them from worship. Offer opportunities for our adults, offer children opportunities to plan elements of worship. One of the churches that I was involved with, we always had a young person on the worship team who always came up with these wild, amazing, wonderful things that sometimes we could do, sometimes we could not, but it stretched us. It helped us to grow and see worship as something that was malleable, as long as the liturgy is there. Make sure that children are present for the sacraments. If nothing else, just make sure that that happens. Equip adults to include children in worship. So educate them, help them understand what children need, and keep telling them what children need. Help adults to model. Maybe in the pews, talk to adults about what we should do in the pews to make sure that children see us doing certain things and creating relationships with them in the pews. It can happen. Encourage adults to listen to children, to really hear what's on their minds, and equip adults to teach about the sacraments. Kathy has some great things on the website about sacraments, and I think every adult would do well I'm sorry, I'm rushing because I know we're running out of time. Every adult would do well to take part in that. So what does the community gain? I'll leave you with this. Bishop Jonathan Holston, who is the bishop here in South Carolina, came out of North Georgia. This amazing thing, when I interviewed him for a webcast once, he said, when you hear the sounds of children in worship, you know that the church will live on. There's something about knowing, especially for older adults, knowing that the church will go on. The church is going to go on anyway, but what is it going to look like and who is going to be present? Here are a few of my favorite resources. There are a lot out there, but these are some of my faves. I know this will be recorded, so you can come back to this. And as you move forward, keep the actions of Jesus in focus. Know your why before you go in and talk to anyone or before you start creating new ways of doing things. Advocate for your children to be engaged. Equip your parents and adults. Keep listening to one another and to your families, and focus on creating that deep sense of belonging. Make sure every child knows that they belong where they are.